My sister spent 8 years casually wishing I were dead, and my parents enabled every second of it. Now it is haunting her wedding. My younger sister Haley started saying she wished I were dead when she was 16 and I was 19. Not in anger during fights, but casually like she was talking about the weather. I'd walk into the kitchen and she'd look at Mom and say, "Wouldn't it be nice if I just didn't exist?" Mom would tell her to stop being dramatic, but never actually punished her. Dad said she was going through a phase and I needed to be the bigger person. The phase lasted 8 years. In college, Haley would call me just to say she'd had a dream I died and woke up disappointed it wasn't real. When I graduated nursing school, she told everyone at my party that the world would be better off with one less nurse if it was me. My aunt asked her why she'd say something so horrible, and Haley said she was just being honest about her feelings. At Christmas, she'd make wishes on the turkey wishbone that I'd disappear forever, saying it loud enough for Grandma to hear. Grandma would clutch her chest, and Haley would laugh, saying it was just sibling rivalry. When I got engaged to Brett, Haley told him he could do better and should hope I died before the wedding so he could find someone worth marrying. Brett was so shocked he didn't know how to respond. Haley said she was protecting him from making a mistake. My parents invited us for dinner every Sunday, and Haley would spend the entire meal listing ways I could die that week. Car accident on Monday, food poisoning on Tuesday, falling downstairs on Wednesday. She'd present it like a weather forecast while eating Mom's pot roast. Mom would weakly protest, but Dad would say ignoring her was the best response. I stopped going to dinners but then got guilt-tripped about abandoning family. The worst was when I had appendicitis and was rushed to the hospital. Haley showed up and told the nurse she was hoping this was finally it. The nurse asked what she meant, and Haley said she'd been waiting for me to die for years, and thought this might be her chance. The nurse called security and had Haley removed, but my parents said I was cruel for not letting my sister visit during a medical emergency. When I tried to go no contact, my parents said I was tearing the family apart over words. Just words. As if hearing your sister wish for your death twice a week for 8 years was nothing. They said Haley was jealous I was older and more accomplished, and I should feel sorry for her. I was exhausted from being understanding about someone who wanted me dead. Then Haley got engaged to Tom and suddenly needed me. She wanted me as a bridesmaid because it would look bad if her only sister wasn't in the wedding. She wanted me to help with planning because I'd just had my wedding. She wanted my discount with vendors because I worked at the hospital with their cousin. After years of wishing me dead, she expected me to celebrate her life milestone. I agreed to be a bridesmaid but had my own plans. The thing about Haley's death wishes was she always said them quietly enough that only family heard. She was smart about keeping her image clean with strangers. But she didn't know that her wedding photographer, Julia, was my patient's daughter. Julia's mom had been my favorite patient during her cancer treatment, and we'd become close. Julia gave me a friends and family discount for my wedding, and we'd stayed in touch. When Julia got the booking for Haley's wedding, she called me immediately, recognizing the last name. During the engagement photo session, Julia kept her recorder running the entire time, not just during shots. She captured Haley telling me she wished I'd died instead of getting engaged first. She recorded Haley saying if I dropped dead before the wedding, she'd save money on a bridesmaid dress. She got Haley telling Tom that she prayed every night I'd disappear forever. Tom laughed nervously and said that was dark, but Haley insisted she was serious. At the rehearsal dinner, Julia was documenting everything and caught Haley's toast where she said she was glad I was alive for once, just so I could witness her happiness since I'd never have a marriage this perfect. My parents smiled like this was sweet. Julia kept recording as Haley pulled me aside and whispered she still wished I was dead, but needed me to smile for photos tomorrow. The wedding day came and Julia had compiled everything. Before the ceremony, she asked Haley if she wanted to review some of the best moments she'd captured. She played the compilation on her camera screen, just loud enough for the wedding party to hear. Haley's friends heard her wishing me dead 20 different times. Tom's family heard her saying she'd celebrate if I died. The minister heard her telling me she fantasized about my funeral. The makeup artist heard everything while fixing Haley's lipstick. The room went completely silent. Tom's parents sat 2 chairs away from Haley, and I watched Dylan reach into his jacket pocket like he was going for his phone. His hand stayed there, fingers wrapped around something while his eyes stayed locked on Julia's camera screen. Sophia grabbed his arm with both hands, her knuckles going white as Haley's voice came through the speaker saying she'd save money on my bridesmaid dress if I just dropped dead already. The color drained from Sophia's face so fast I thought she might pass out. She leaned into her husband and whispered something I couldn't hear, but I saw her mouth form the words, "Call it off." And Dylan nodded once, sharp and final. His phone came out of his pocket and he started scrolling through contacts while the compilation kept playing. Nobody tried to stop him. Nobody even looked at him except Sophia, who kept her death grip on his arm like she was holding herself upright through him. The makeup artist backed away from her station slowly, her brushes still in hand, eyes wide as Haley's recorded voice filled the room, talking about how she'd celebrate if I died in a car accident. Camden stood frozen near the dress rack, one hand pressed over her mouth while the other hung limp at her side. She was staring at Haley like she'd never seen her before, like the person in the wedding dress was a complete stranger wearing her best friend's face. The other bridesmaids clustered by the door in a tight group, their heads bent together as they whispered back and forth. I caught pieces of their conversation, words like always knew and fake and poor girl floating across the room. They kept shooting looks at Haley, disgust written all over their faces, then looking at me with something that might have been pity or maybe just shock. Haley stood in the center of the room in her white dress, completely still except for her hands which kept opening and closing at her sides. Her face went through changes so fast it was hard to track. First shock, mouth dropping open and eyes going huge. Then rage, her jaw clenching and face going red. Then panic as she looked around the room and saw everyone watching her, judging her, seeing her exactly as she really was for the first time. The recording switched to a clip from the rehearsal dinner where Haley was telling Tom she prayed every night that I'd disappear forever. Haley lunged toward Julia with her hands out like she was going to grab the camera. She was screaming that it was fake, that Julia had edited everything, that none of it was real. Her voice came out high and desperate, cracking on the words. The makeup artist moved faster than I expected, stepping between Haley and Julia with her body blocking the camera. She held her hands up like she was calming a wild animal, taking small steps backward to keep distance between Haley and the equipment. The makeup artist's face had gone pale and her hands were shaking, but she kept herself planted between the bride and the photographer. Julia stayed calm behind her, holding the camera steady, still playing the compilation for everyone to hear. Haley tried to push past the makeup artist, but the woman stood firm, and something about that, about someone being genuinely scared of her, made Haley stop moving. She stood there breathing hard, her chest heaving under all that white lace. Tom hadn't moved from his spot near the window. His face had gone completely pale, almost gray, and his hands were shaking where they gripped the window frame. He opened his mouth twice before any sound came out, and when he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet, everyone had to strain to hear him. He asked Haley if any of it was true. Just those 6 words, but they landed in the room like a bomb. Haley spun toward him so fast her dress swirled around her legs. She started explaining, words tumbling over each other, saying I was being dramatic and taking everything out of context. She said it was just sibling rivalry, that all sisters talked like that I was making a big deal out of nothing. Her voice sounded wrong even to her, I could tell. It came out hollow and thin, like she was reading lines she didn't believe. Tom just stared at her, waiting, and Haley kept talking faster and faster, trying to fill the silence with explanations that didn't explain anything. My mother came rushing forward from wherever she'd been standing, her heels clicking loud on the floor. She was doing her damage control voice, the one she used when Haley got caught doing something bad and Mom needed to smooth it over. She told everyone that sisters say things they don't mean all the time, that this was just a big misunderstanding, that families have complicated dynamics. My father appeared behind her like he always did, nodding along with everything she said. He opened his mouth to back her up, starting to say that Haley was just going through a phase and everyone needed to calm down. Dylan cut him off mid-sentence. His voice came out cold and sharp, nothing like the polite small talk from the rehearsal dinner. He asked what kind of phase lasts 8 years. My father's mouth hung open with no sound coming out. Dylan stood up from his chair, phone still in his hand, and looked at my parents like they were something disgusting he'd found on his shoe. He said he'd heard enough and needed to make some calls, and the way he said it made it clear those calls were about canceling everything. The minister had been standing near the door this whole time, watching everything unfold with his hands clasped in front of him. He cleared his throat softly and said he needed a moment to pray and consider whether he could officiate this ceremony in good conscience. The words were polite, but everyone heard what he really meant. He was done. He walked out of the bridal suite without waiting for a response, his shoes making soft sounds on the carpet until the door closed behind him and cut off even that small noise. The silence that followed felt huge. Without him, there was no wedding. Everyone knew it. You could see the knowledge spreading across faces, people doing the math and realizing this whole thing was falling apart right now, right here, before the ceremony even started. Haley made a sound like a wounded animal, high and broken, and started crying. Not pretty crying, not the kind you see in movies. Ugly crying with her face going red and her makeup running in black streaks down her cheeks. Her whole body shook with it. I stood near the back of the room where I'd been this whole time, pressed against the wall like I could disappear into it. Everything felt strange and distant, like I was watching it happen to someone else. Part of me felt this huge wave of relief, this sense of finally people are seeing what I've been living with. But another part of me felt shocked at how fast it was all falling apart, how completely Haley's perfect day was crumbling. I'd wanted people to know the truth, but I hadn't really thought past that moment, hadn't pictured this exact scene with everyone staring and Haley crying, and the wedding actually stopping. Brett's hand squeezed mine and I jumped a little, realizing he was standing right next to me. I didn't even know when he'd come into the room. He must have slipped in during the chaos, found his way to my side without me noticing. He didn't say anything, just stood there holding my hand, his presence solid and real when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. Giselle came toward me slowly, like she was approaching something fragile that might break. She stopped a few feet away and looked at me with eyes that were shiny with tears. She said she was sorry for not saying something sooner when she noticed how Haley treated me. Her voice came out thick and rough. She admitted she'd thought the comments at the bachelorette party were just drunk meanness, the kind of thing people say when they've had too much wine and their filters are gone. But hearing 8 years of it, hearing all those recordings one after another, hearing Haley wish me dead in so many different ways, it made her physically sick. She pressed one hand against her stomach like she actually might throw up. She said she should have known it was more than just party talk, should have seen the pattern, should have said something to someone. I didn't know what to say back, so I just nodded. What was there to say? She wasn't wrong. Sophia left Dylan's side and walked straight up to my parents. She planted herself right in front of them, close enough that they had to look at her, couldn't look away or pretend she wasn't there. She asked them how they could allow one daughter to torment another for nearly 10 years. The question came out quiet but hard, each word crisp and clear. My mother started explaining like she'd explained 1,000 times before. She said Haley was jealous, that she needed understanding, that being the younger sister was hard. Sophia cut her off. She said that wasn't parenting, that was enabling abuse. The word abuse hung in the air. Nobody had used that word before. My parents had always called it sibling rivalry, drama, Haley going through a phase. But Sophia said abuse, and suddenly that's what it was, what it had always been. My mother's face went red and my father looked at the floor. Sophia wasn't done. She said her son deserved to marry someone who knew how to love, not someone who spent years casually wishing death on family members. Haley grabbed Tom's arms with both hands, her fingers digging into his sleeves. She was begging him to look at her, to remember that she loved him, to remember this was supposed to be their special day. Her voice came out desperate and high, words running together. She said they'd planned everything, that everyone was here, that they were supposed to be getting married right now. Tom gently pulled her hands off his arms, unwrapping her fingers one at a time. He said he needed time to think about whether he could marry someone capable of wishing their own sister dead for 8 years. The way he said it, so calm and quiet after all of Haley's screaming and crying, somehow made it worse. He wasn't angry, he was just done. He stepped back from her and Haley reached for him again, but he kept backing up until he was out of reach. She stood there with her arms still outstretched, frozen in place, and I watched her face as she finally understood that this was really happening, that her wedding day was over before it even began. Camden moved first. She stepped back from Haley like she'd just discovered something rotten and said she couldn't be maid of honor anymore. The words came out flat and final. She said she couldn't stand up for someone who would say those horrible things. 2 other bridesmaids grabbed their purses without saying anything. They didn't look at Haley as they walked toward the door. One of them still had bobby pins in her hair from the updo that would never happen now. They just left. The door clicked shut behind them and the sound felt louder than it should have been. Lori pushed through the door seconds later. She looked around the room, taking in Haley's tears and my mother's red face, and the abandoned bouquets on the table. Someone near the mirror filled her in quickly. I watched Lori's expression change as she heard about the recordings. Her mouth got tight and her eyes went hard. She turned to my parents and just stared at them for a long moment. Then she said she'd tried to tell them years ago. She said she'd told them Haley's behavior wasn't normal, and they'd refused to listen. My father started to respond, but Lori held up one hand and he went quiet. The disappointment on her face was worse than anger would have been. Haley spun toward me. Her face twisted up with rage and she screamed that I'd ruined everything. She said I destroyed her wedding day and destroyed her whole life. Her voice cracked on the last word. Spit flew from her mouth. I stayed calm even though my heart was beating hard. I told her I didn't ruin anything. I said I just let people hear her own words. I reminded her she was the one who chose to say those things for 8 years. My voice came out steady and quiet. That seemed to make her even angrier. The makeup artist started packing her brushes into their case. She moved fast like she wanted to get out as soon as possible. Other vendors followed her lead. Someone unplugged the lighting equipment. Another person rolled up the backdrop they'd brought for photos. the room filled with the sound of zippers and latches clicking shut. Julia moved closer to me. She kept her camera in her hands, pointed down but ready. I realized she was positioning herself between me and Haley in case things got physical. The thought that my sister might actually try to hurt me should have been shocking, but it wasn't. Dylan walked over to Tom and put his hand on Tom's shoulder. They moved toward the window away from everyone else. I could see Dylan's mouth moving and Tom nodding. Tears ran down Tom's face, but he kept listening. His father's hand stayed on his shoulder the whole time. Whatever Dylan was saying seemed important. Tom wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. They stood there for what felt like a long time but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. My mother tried one more time to fix everything. She suggested everyone take a break and come back in an hour. She said emotions were running high and people needed to calm down. Sophia cut her off. Her voice came out cold and sharp like ice. She said no amount of time would erase what everyone just heard. She said her son deserved better than marrying someone with that much darkness inside her. The words hung in the air. My mother's face went even redder, but she didn't respond. Haley collapsed into one of the chairs. Her wedding dress spread out around her like a white puddle. Black mascara streaked down both cheeks. She stared at nothing for a moment. Then she looked up at me. The expression on her face was strange, part hatred and part desperation mixed together. I think she finally understood what was happening. I think she finally realized that her words had consequences, that just words could destroy everything she'd planned. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. Brett leaned close to my ear. He whispered, asking if I was okay and if I wanted to leave. His hand squeezed mine. I shook my head. I told him I needed to stay. I needed to see this through to the end. After 8 years of keeping quiet and being the bigger person, I needed to witness what happened when the truth finally came out. Brett nodded and stayed beside me. His presence felt solid and grounding. Tom came back from his conversation with his father. He walked slowly across the room toward Haley. Everyone went quiet watching him. He stopped a few feet away from her chair. He said he couldn't marry her today. Maybe not ever. His voice shook, but the words were clear. He said he needed time to think about whether the person he thought he knew even existed. He said maybe she'd been hiding this cruelty beneath a perfect surface all along. Haley reached for him, but he stepped back out of range. Haley started begging. She grabbed at Tom's sleeves, trying to make him look at her. She promised she would change. She swore she'd never say anything like that again. The words tumbled out desperate and fast. Tom gently pulled her hands off his arms. He unwrapped her fingers one at a time. He said the problem wasn't whether she'd say it again. The problem was that she'd said it hundreds of times over 8 years. The problem was she never thought there was anything wrong with it. He said that like it was the most important part. Because it was. My father cleared his throat and stepped forward. He said Haley was young and made mistakes but deserved forgiveness. His voice carried that same dismissive tone he'd used for 8 years when telling me to be the bigger person. He said everyone says things they don't mean when they're emotional, and we shouldn't judge her too harshly for words spoken in private moments. The room stayed quiet while he talked. He looked around at Tom's family like he expected them to agree with him. But Dylan turned toward my father with an expression I'd never seen before. His jaw was tight and his eyes were cold. He said wishing someone dead wasn't a mistake. His voice came out sharp and clear. He said it was a character flaw that revealed something fundamental about who a person really is underneath their smile. He said his son shouldn't have to spend his life wondering if his wife was capable of genuine love or if she'd turn that darkness on him someday. He said no amount of youth or jealousy excused 8 years of calculated cruelty. My father's face went red, but he didn't respond. The silence that followed felt heavy and uncomfortable. The remaining bridesmaids shuffled near the door. They kept glancing at each other and then at Haley. Their body language screamed that they wanted to leave, but nobody had officially dismissed them. One girl held her bouquet like a shield in front of her chest. Another kept adjusting her dress straps nervously. They were trapped between loyalty to their friend and the horror of what they'd just heard. Camden stood with her arms crossed watching them. She walked over to the group and told them they should go. She said there wasn't going to be a wedding today. Her voice was firm and sad at the same time. She said they didn't need to stay for this anymore. The bridesmaids practically ran from the room. I heard their heels clicking fast down the hallway outside. The door swung shut behind them with a soft thud. The bridal suite felt emptier without them, more exposed somehow. Julia moved closer to me. She kept her camera bag on her shoulder and her voice low. She asked if I wanted copies of all the recordings for my own records. Her eyes were kind and understanding. I nodded yes without even thinking about it. Part of me knew I'd need proof of this moment. Evidence that I didn't imagine 8 years of cruelty. Evidence that people finally witnessed the truth instead of dismissing it as sibling rivalry or me being too sensitive. Julia pulled out a small USB drive from her bag. She pressed it into my palm and closed my fingers around it. She whispered that she'd backed everything up twice just in case. She said the files were labeled by date and location. I squeezed the USB drive tight in my hand. It felt solid and real. Physical proof that I wasn't crazy or dramatic. That Haley really had spent 8 years casually wishing me dead while everyone pretended it was normal. My mother spun toward me. Her face was twisted with anger and something that looked like panic. She said I was vindictive and cruel. She said I'd orchestrated this public humiliation on purpose to destroy Haley's special day. Her voice got louder with each word. She said I should be ashamed of myself for planning this revenge. She said I'd always been jealous of Haley's beauty and popularity. I felt Brett's hand squeeze mine, but I pulled away. I needed to stand on my own for this. I looked at my mother and said I didn't orchestrate anything except letting people hear Haley's own words. I said I didn't add commentary or edit anything. I just made sure the truth came out instead of staying hidden in family dinners and private moments. I said if Haley felt humiliated, it was because her behavior was humiliating. I said maybe she should feel ashamed of wishing her sister dead for 8 years, instead of me feeling ashamed for finally exposing it. My mother's mouth opened and closed, but nothing came out. Haley suddenly stood up from her chair. Her wedding dress rustled around her. She reached up and grabbed her veil with both hands. She ripped it off her head and threw it across the room. The veil hit the wall and slid down to the floor in a puddle of white tulle. She screamed that I'd always been jealous of her. Her voice was raw and desperate. She said I couldn't stand to see her happy, so I sabotaged everything. She said I'd been plotting this for months because I was bitter about my own boring life. She said I wanted to ruin her perfect day because mine hadn't been as good. She was completely rewriting history, making herself the victim, turning 8 years of death wishes into me being the jealous older sister who couldn't handle her success. Some of Tom's relatives shifted uncomfortably, and I could see them processing whether to believe her version or trust what they'd heard on the recordings. Brett stepped forward. His movement was calm and deliberate. He said he wanted to remind everyone of something. His voice stayed quiet, but somehow everyone heard him clearly. He said Haley had told him to his face that he should hope I died before our wedding, so he could find someone worth marrying. He said that wasn't taken out of context or misunderstood. He said she looked him in the eyes and said those exact words while completely sober at a family dinner. He said he'd been too shocked to respond at the time, but he remembered every word. His testimony carried weight because he was an outsider, someone with no reason to lie or exaggerate. Several people nodded slowly. I saw recognition on their faces. They were remembering other incidents they'd witnessed over the years. Small moments they'd dismissed as jokes or sibling rivalry. Now those moments were adding up to a pattern they couldn't ignore anymore. Tom spoke to his parents. His voice sounded tired and defeated. He said he wanted to leave. He asked if they could help him cancel the reception and notify guests. He didn't look at Haley while he talked. Sophia immediately took charge. She pulled out her phone and started making a list. She said she'd handle the vendors and guests. She said she'd explain there was a family emergency, and the wedding was postponed indefinitely. She didn't say canceled, but everyone understood what indefinitely meant. Dylan put his hand on Tom's shoulder and said he'd help gather Tom's things from the groom's suite. He said they could leave through the back entrance to avoid guests who were starting to arrive. Tom nodded. He still hadn't looked at Haley. His parents moved toward the door with him between them. They formed a protective barrier around their son. I watched them prepare to leave and felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Lori appeared in the doorway. She must have heard the commotion from wherever she'd been waiting. She took in the scene quickly. The scattered bridesmaids' bouquets on the floor. Haley's veil crumpled against the wall. The tense faces and Tom preparing to leave. She walked straight to me and wrapped her arms around me. She hugged me tight and whispered that she was proud of me. Her voice was thick with emotion. She said she was proud of me for finally standing up for myself after 8 years of being told to take the high road. She said she wished she'd done more to protect me over the years. She said she'd seen the cruelty but let my parents convince her it wasn't her place to interfere. She said she was glad the truth was finally out in the open where it couldn't be ignored or minimized anymore. I hugged her back and felt tears starting behind my eyes. Having someone validate my experience meant more than I could express. Haley watched Tom leave with his parents. Her eyes followed them to the door and down the hallway. I saw the exact moment it hit her. The realization that this was really happening. That her wedding was canceled. That her relationship might be over. That all her planning and dreaming had fallen apart in less than an hour. Her face changed. The anger drained away and left something smaller and more vulnerable. She sank back into the chair. Her expensive wedding dress spread out around her like a white pool. She looked tiny sitting there, defeated. The perfect bride image completely shattered. She stared at the floor and didn't say anything. For the first time all day, she had nothing to say. No casual death wish. No rewritten history. Just silence and the weight of consequences she'd never expected to face. My mother made one more attempt. She turned to me with tears in her eyes. She said I'd destroyed my sister's happiness. She said I'd torn the family apart. Her voice shook with emotion and accusation. She said I should have come to her privately if I had concerns instead of humiliating Haley in front of everyone. She said families were supposed to protect each other and I'd betrayed that trust. I looked at her and felt something shift inside me. I said Haley spent 8 years trying to destroy my happiness by wishing me dead twice a week. I said the family was already torn apart and everyone just pretended not to notice. I said coming to her privately hadn't worked because she'd spent 8 years telling me to be understanding while doing nothing to stop the abuse. I said protecting each other should have started when Haley first said she wished I didn't exist, and Mom weakly told her to stop being dramatic without any real consequences. I said I was done pretending everything was normal when it never had been. Camden stopped at the door and looked back at Haley. She said she felt betrayed and disgusted by what she'd heard. She said she'd defended Haley countless times when other people said she seemed fake. She said those people were right all along. Camden walked out without waiting for a response. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow felt louder than if she'd slammed it. 2 other bridesmaids followed her immediately. They grabbed their purses and bouquets and rushed out like the room was on fire. Haley watched them leave with her mouth hanging open. She looked around at the remaining people like she expected someone to stop them. Nobody moved. Julia started packing her camera equipment. She wrapped cords around her hands and tucked lenses into padded bags. Her movements were calm and methodical. She caught my eye and gave me a small nod. Just a tiny movement of her head, but it meant everything. I felt my throat get tight with emotion. This woman barely knew me, but she'd helped expose 8 years of cruelty. She'd documented everything and played it at exactly the right moment. She'd given me proof when nobody else would believe me. I wanted to thank her, but couldn't find words big enough. My father moved toward me with his hands out like he was approaching a scared animal. He asked if I was satisfied now that I'd ruined Haley's wedding. His voice was tight with anger he was trying to control. He said I'd destroyed my sister's happiness and torn the family apart. I looked at him and felt something break inside me. I told him I wasn't satisfied. I told him I was exhausted. I said I'd spent 8 years being told to be the bigger person, while Haley wished me dead twice a week. I said I was relieved that other people knew the truth now. I said I was tired of being the only one who had to understand and forgive and take the high road. My father's face turned red. He opened his mouth to argue, but Tom appeared in the doorway. Tom looked terrible. His eyes were red and his tie was loose around his neck. He walked straight to Haley without looking at anyone else. He told her he'd contact her in a few days once he'd had time to think. He said right now he couldn't even look at her. His voice cracked on the last word. Haley reached for his hand. She grabbed at his fingers desperately. Tom pulled away like her touch burned him. The rejection on her face was raw and real. It was the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her all day. Not the performed tears or the angry outbursts. This was real hurt showing through. Tom left again and the room felt smaller without him. The makeup artist approached me slowly. She held her bag in front of her like a shield. She said she had a sister too. She said she couldn't imagine treating her the way Haley treated me. Her voice was soft and kind. She told me I was brave to expose the truth. She said she hoped I'd find peace now that people knew what I'd been dealing with. I thanked her and my voice came out scratchy. She squeezed my arm gently before leaving. My mother and father moved to the corner of the room. They leaned their heads together and spoke in urgent whispers. I watched them gesture and shake their heads. They looked worried and angry. I realized they weren't concerned about me or Haley. They were trying to figure out how to spin this situation to their friends, how to explain to extended family why the wedding was canceled, how to protect their reputation. 8 years of abuse happened under their roof, and they were worried about what people would think. They'd spent 8 years telling me to be understanding while doing nothing to stop Haley. They'd minimized and dismissed and enabled. Now they were facing consequences, and all they cared about was damage control. Haley stood up from her chair. She walked toward me with her wedding dress rustling. Her makeup was smeared and her hair was coming loose from its fancy style. She looked directly at me for the first time since the recording played. She asked why I would do this to her on her wedding day. Her voice shook with emotion. Real or performed, I couldn't tell anymore. I said she did this to herself. I said 8 years of cruelty led to this moment. I said I simply made sure people heard what she'd been saying when she thought only family was listening. I said I was tired of being the only one who knew the truth. Haley's face twisted. She said I was jealous and vindictive. She said I couldn't stand to see her happy. I didn't respond because there was no point. She'd rewrite history no matter what I said. Brett touched my elbow. He said we should leave and let my family deal with the aftermath. He said staying longer would just mean more circular arguments that wouldn't change anything. I agreed because he was right. I'd accomplished what I needed to. The truth was out. People had heard Haley's own words. Staying would just mean listening to my parents defend her and blame me. We started walking toward the door. My mother's voice called after me. She said I wasn't welcome at family events anymore if I was going to cause this kind of drama. Her voice was sharp and cold. I turned back to look at her. I told her that was fine. I said I'd spent 8 years being told to tolerate abuse at family events. I said I was done pretending everything was normal when it never had been. My mother's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Julia walked out with us. She reached into her camera bag and pulled out a small USB drive. She handed it to me and said she'd made backups. She said I might need proof of what happened. I took the drive and held it tight in my palm. Julia hugged me goodbye. She told me to take care of myself. She said exposing abuse takes courage even when it feels like revenge. Her words made my eyes burn with tears I'd been holding back. We walked down the hallway together. Behind us, I could hear my mother's voice rising. I could hear Haley crying. I could hear my father trying to calm everyone down. The sounds faded as we got farther away. Brett kept his hand on my back. Julia walked beside us until we reached the parking lot. She said goodbye one more time and headed to her car. Brett and I stood by our car for a minute. I looked back at the venue. It was supposed to be Haley's perfect day. White flowers and elegant decorations and a ceremony in front of everyone she knew. Instead, it was canceled. Her bridesmaids had left. Her groom had walked away. Her perfect image was shattered. I should have felt guilty, but I just felt tired. 8 years of casual cruelty. 8 years of death wishes. 8 years of being told to understand and forgive. I was done. Brett wrapped his arms around me in the parking lot and I started crying. 8 years of holding everything in came out all at once. My shoulders shook and I couldn't stop the tears from coming. Brett held me tighter and told me I did the right thing. He said he was proud of me for refusing to stay silent anymore. I knew the family consequences would be severe, but I couldn't bring myself to care in that moment. We stood there for several minutes while I cried and he rubbed my back. Other guests started arriving for the ceremony, and they looked confused seeing us in the parking lot. Brett guided me to our car and helped me into the passenger seat. We sat there for a while before he started the engine. I watched more wedding guests arrive through the windshield. They walked toward the entrance in their fancy clothes carrying wrapped presents. Some of them checked their phones looking confused. A few stood near the entrance talking to each other and gesturing. I felt guilty for a moment about disrupting everyone's plans. Then I remembered Haley showing up at the hospital during my appendicitis. I remembered her telling the nurse she hoped this was finally it. The guilt disappeared. Brett started driving and asked how I was feeling. I admitted I didn't know yet. Part of me felt vindicated that people finally witnessed Haley's cruelty. Another part felt guilty about the public humiliation, even though she brought it on herself. Brett reached over and squeezed my hand. He reminded me that I didn't create those recordings. I didn't make Haley say those things. I just made sure people heard what she'd been saying when she thought only family was listening. My phone started buzzing in my purse. I pulled it out and saw text messages flooding in from family members. Lori sent a message saying she was proud of me and I did what needed to be done. Several cousins sent angry messages. They said I went too far. They said I should have handled it privately. I stared at those messages thinking about 8 years of private suffering. 8 years of being told to be the bigger person. 8 years of death wishes at Sunday dinners. Private hadn't worked. Private meant everyone could pretend nothing was wrong. My phone kept buzzing with more messages. Some supportive, most angry. I turned it off and dropped it back in my purse. Brett glanced over and I told him I needed a few days away from everyone to process what just happened. He immediately suggested we go to his parents' lake house. Nobody could bother us there. I felt grateful for a partner who understood I needed space to decompress. We drove straight there without stopping at home first. The lake house sat on a quiet stretch of water surrounded by trees. Brett's parents rarely used it during summer, so we had it to ourselves. I spent the first day mostly sleeping. Brett brought me food and water but didn't push me to talk. He sat beside me on the couch and held my hand. Sometimes he read while I stared out the window at the water. The emotional exhaustion from years of abuse and the intensity of finally exposing it hit me all at once. I couldn't process anything. I just needed to exist without thinking. The second day I woke up feeling less numb. I sat on the deck overlooking the lake and started feeling more aware of what I'd done. I didn't regret exposing Haley's cruelty. That felt right and necessary. But I recognized that I'd permanently damaged family relationships. There was no going back to how things were before. Brett brought me coffee and sat in the chair next to mine. We took a long walk around the lake and talked about what happens next. He reminded me that healthy families don't enable one member to abuse another for 8 years. He said if my parents choose Haley over accountability, that reveals who they've always been. I knew he was right, but it still hurt. When we got back to the house, I checked my email on Brett's laptop. I saw a long message from Tom. My stomach clenched as I opened it. He thanked me for showing him who Haley really is before he married her. He said he'd called off the engagement permanently. He couldn't trust someone who hid that much cruelty. He was grateful even though it hurt right now. Reading Tom's email made me cry again. This time the tears felt different. Relief mixed with the sadness. At least one person understood I didn't do this out of spite. I wrote back thanking him for listening. I apologized that he had to learn the truth this way. I agreed he deserved better than someone who could wish death on family for 8 years. Brett read over my shoulder and wrapped his arms around me from behind. He kissed the top of my head and told me everything would be okay eventually. I leaned back against him and hoped he was right. The next morning at the lake house, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Lori. I answered, and she told me Haley had been holed up in my parents' house for 3 days, barely leaving her bedroom. My mother was apparently furious with me and spent hours ranting about how I'd destroyed Haley's special day. But my father had been quieter than usual, according to Lori. She said he'd been sitting in his study staring out the window, and she wondered if he was finally starting to see how his years of dismissing Haley's cruelty had led to this disaster. I thanked Lori for checking on me and we hung up. Brett brought me coffee on the deck and I told him what Lori had said. He nodded and said maybe my father was beginning to understand, but that didn't fix 8 years of enabling. I agreed, and we spent the rest of the morning walking along the lakeshore in comfortable silence. 2 days later, I got a message on social media from Giselle asking if we could meet for coffee. I hesitated, but something about her apology at the wedding felt genuine, so I agreed. We met at a small cafe near my apartment the following afternoon. Giselle looked nervous when I arrived and immediately apologized again for not speaking up sooner. She told me she'd been thinking constantly about all the times she'd noticed Haley being subtly cruel to me, but dismissed it as normal sister stuff. She said she felt guilty for not questioning why Haley always made little digs at me, or why I seemed uncomfortable at events. I stirred my coffee and listened as she talked about specific moments she now saw differently. The bachelorette party comment about me being alive to witness Haley's happiness. The rehearsal dinner where Haley kept comparing our lives. Little comments over the years that Giselle had brushed off as sibling rivalry. I told Giselle she wasn't responsible for my family's problems. I said I appreciated her willingness to acknowledge what she'd seen, but she couldn't have fixed my parents' failure to protect me. Giselle nodded but still looked troubled. She asked if I thought Haley would ever change. I set down my cup and considered the question. I told her honestly that I didn't know because change requires admitting you did something wrong, and Haley still seemed convinced she was the victim in all this. Giselle agreed that Haley's social media posts since the canceled wedding had all been about betrayal and humiliation, with no acknowledgement of her own behavior. We finished our coffee and Giselle hugged me goodbye, saying she hoped I found peace. I drove home feeling oddly lighter, having someone outside my immediate family validate what I'd experienced. 2 weeks after the wedding disaster, an email appeared in my inbox from my mother. The subject line read "Family Boundaries," and my stomach clenched as I opened it. The email was formal and cold, like she was writing to a business associate instead of her daughter. She said she and my father needed time and space before they could have a relationship with me again. She wrote that my actions at Haley's wedding were unacceptable and caused unnecessary pain to the entire family. There was no mention of 8 years of death wishes. No acknowledgement of their failure to stop Haley's cruelty. No recognition that I'd suffered at all. The email treated me like I was the problem, and they were the victims of my vindictive behavior. I read it 3 times, feeling numb. I showed Brett the email when he got home from work. His face went red as he read, and he actually raised his voice, saying my parents were continuing to enable Haley by punishing me for exposing abuse. He said they were choosing comfort over accountability, and it proved they'd never been willing to protect me. I agreed with him, but felt a strange sense of peace settling over me. Their response confirmed I'd made the right choice. Nothing was going to change unless I forced the truth into the open, and even now they were choosing to blame me rather than face their own failures. Brett pulled me into a hug, and I let myself feel relieved instead of guilty. I'd spent 8 years waiting for my parents to see what Haley was doing, and now I knew they'd always chosen to look away. The following week, I made an appointment with a therapist. I sat in her office and explained 8 years of casual death wishes, and my parents' enablement and the wedding disaster that finally exposed everything. The therapist listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she told me I wasn't wrong to protect myself. She said exposing abuse isn't vindictive even when it happens publicly. We spent the next several sessions working through my complicated feelings about losing my family, even though they'd been hurting me. She helped me understand that grief was normal, even when the relationship was toxic. I started processing years of emotional damage I'd been carrying while trying to be the bigger person. One evening, Brett and I were making dinner when he suddenly suggested we elope. He said we could skip all the family drama of a traditional wedding and just get married at the courthouse. I stopped chopping vegetables and looked at him. He was serious. I immediately said yes. We planned a simple courthouse ceremony with just his parents and Lori invited. The day arrived and I wore a simple white dress I'd bought the week before. Brett's parents brought flowers and Lori cried happy tears as we exchanged vows. The ceremony took 15 minutes and felt perfect because everyone there genuinely loved and supported us. No death wishes, no subtle cruelty, just people who wanted us to be happy. We had lunch at a nice restaurant afterward, and I felt more joy in those few hours than I'd felt at any family gathering in years. Lori pulled me aside at the restaurant and told me privately she'd confronted my parents about their enabling behavior. She said they'd been defensive and insisted they'd done their best with a difficult situation. But Lori had planted seeds of doubt, asking them hard questions about why they never punished Haley or protected me. She didn't think they'd apologize anytime soon, because that would require admitting they'd failed as parents. But at least someone in the family was holding them accountable, and maybe eventually those seeds would grow into real understanding. I hugged Lori and thanked her for being the one adult who'd consistently tried to help me. 3 months after the canceled wedding, Lori called with news about Haley. She said Haley had started therapy at Tom's insistence if she wanted any chance of reconciliation. I asked if Lori thought Haley was genuinely working on herself, or just going through the motions to get Tom back. Lori admitted she didn't know, but said at least Haley was facing some consequences for her behavior. I hung up feeling uncertain about what it meant. Part of me hoped Haley would actually change and recognize how much damage she'd caused, but another part doubted whether someone who'd casually wished me dead for 8 years could really transform into a better person. I opened social media that evening and scrolled through posts from extended family members. Passive-aggressive messages about forgiveness and family loyalty filled my feed. Cousins posting quotes about letting go of grudges. Aunts sharing articles about the importance of family bonds. None of them mentioned 8 years of abuse or my parents' failure to protect me. They just wanted everything to go back to normal, which meant me accepting Haley's cruelty in silence. I went through my contacts and blocked most of my extended family. The people who mattered already knew the truth. I was learning that protecting my peace mattered more than maintaining relationships with people who enabled abuse and expected me to keep quiet about it. Brett brought up the idea of moving while we were doing dishes one evening. He said his company had been offering remote work options, and we could go anywhere. I looked at the soapy plate in my hands and realized nothing was keeping us here except habit and pain. I told him I could find nursing work in any city, and we should start looking at places far enough away that surprise family visits wouldn't be possible. We spent that weekend researching cities 3 or more hours away, making lists of places with good hospitals and lower costs of living. Brett pulled up apartment listings and I calculated commute times to potential jobs. We talked about starting over somewhere nobody knew our history or expected us to play happy family at Sunday dinners. Within 2 weeks, we had narrowed it down to 3 cities and scheduled visits to each one. The planning gave me something positive to focus on, instead of replaying family drama, or wondering if my parents would ever acknowledge what they'd allowed to happen. Lori called every few days to check on me, and our conversations became the only family contact I maintained. She listened when I needed to vent about my mother's cold email or my father's silence. She validated my feelings instead of asking me to understand Haley's perspective or give my parents more chances. One afternoon, she came over for coffee and admitted she should have done more years ago, when she first noticed how Haley treated me. She said she'd confronted my parents a few times but backed down when they got defensive, and she regretted not pushing harder or offering me a place to stay away from the toxicity. I told her she was the only family member who ever tried to help, and that meant everything. She promised she'd stay in my life no matter what my parents decided, that I deserved family who actually acted like family, instead of people who shared DNA but enabled abuse. 6 months after the canceled wedding, I got a message from Tom through social media. He said he wanted to update me that he and Haley were officially done, that he'd ended things permanently after she kept making excuses in therapy, instead of taking real responsibility. He thanked me again for showing him the truth before he married someone who could hide that much cruelty behind a sweet smile. He mentioned he was dating someone new, a woman who treated service workers with genuine kindness and never said cruel things even as jokes. The contrast had shown him what he almost settled for, and he was grateful, even though learning the truth had been painful. I wrote back thanking him for letting me know and saying I was glad he found someone better. His message made me feel less guilty about the wedding disaster, because at least one person understood I hadn't done it out of spite, but out of desperate need for someone besides family to finally witness what I'd been dealing with. I realized one morning that I hadn't thought about Haley's death wishes in weeks. I was pouring coffee and the thought just appeared, this awareness that the constant background anxiety was gone. For 8 years, I'd lived with this low-grade dread, wondering when she'd say the next cruel thing, or what creative way she'd wish me dead that week. I'd walk into family gatherings braced for impact, never knowing if she'd keep it subtle or say something so horrible even my parents couldn't ignore it. But now I just existed without that weight pressing on my chest every day. I could make plans without factoring in potential family drama or calculating how to avoid Haley at events. The freedom felt strange and guilty at first, like I shouldn't feel this relieved about losing my family. But the relief kept growing anyway because peace turned out to be worth more than blood relations who made me feel worthless. Brett and I moved 3 months later to a city neither of us had ever lived in before. We rented a small house with a backyard and spent weekends exploring neighborhoods and finding our favorite coffee shop. I started a new nursing job at a hospital where nobody knew about my family drama or expected me to explain why my sister wasn't in my life. Brett set up his home office and we established routines that had nothing to do with Sunday dinners or holiday obligations. We made friends through work and a local board game group, people who chose to spend time with us because they enjoyed our company. We hosted dinners where everyone brought food and stayed late playing games and laughing about nothing important. I learned what healthy relationships felt like, how it felt to be around people who didn't make casual comments about wishing I didn't exist. Every dinner party reminded me that I'd made the right choice even though it cost me my immediate family. Lori visited a year after the canceled wedding, driving 3 hours to see our new place and meet our new friends. She walked through our little house admiring how we'd decorated and set things up exactly how we wanted without considering anyone else's opinions. That evening after our friends left from a game night, Lori told me she was proud of how I'd built a life focused on people who respected and valued me. She said watching me laugh freely with friends who genuinely cared about me showed her that I'd made the right choice. I realized sitting there that exposing the truth had cost me my parents and sister, cost me the extended family who valued peace over justice, cost me the fantasy that my family would ever acknowledge what happened or apologize. But it gave me freedom from constant cruelty, gave me peace without wondering what horrible thing would be said next, gave me the chance to surround myself with people who would never casually wish me dead over pot roast. The trade was worth every difficult moment because I'd chosen my own well-being over family loyalty, and that choice had led me here to this small house filled with real love instead of obligatory tolerance.